around the state and providing a variety of educational resources and experiences to be able to do that. We're a small team, and we've worked closely in the past with Katie, Nathan, and other staff and board members at CAEE, and look forward to doing so more into the future. And I see a few familiar names in the participant list. Some of you have likely seen a good chunk of the presentation I'm going to give today, but there are some new bits at the end, because the focus of today is really talking about SWEAP and the Colorado Environmental Education Plan and finding common ground between those two plans and where we can really leverage resources together, identify those challenges and opportunities, and work together to implement both. So I'll go ahead and kick it off with an introduction to SWEAP. And actually, before I do, Kirsten, if you're willing to put up the first two polls. So let's start with the first one. And they're going to ask you how familiar you are with each plan. And that'll give me a sense of how much detail I'll need to get into. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to answer that first one. It looks like the second one is up there as well. All right, maybe a 5-second countdown. Then Kirsten, if you're willing to show those results on the screen, that will be helpful for the whole group. Awesome. All right, so hopefully everybody can see those results. So it looks like we're spread across in terms of how familiar we are with the statewide water education action plan. A few of you, looks like half, are not familiar at all or only slightly familiar. And then a few in the middle, and then a couple who have been more involved. And then the environmental education plan, looks like we're also split across, but looks like maybe on both plans less familiar than we are familiar with each plan. So that's really helpful to know. And I may lean on Katie, if you're willing to stay for the entire time, to give a little bit more info on the EE plan towards the end, but we do have some content from each of the plans that I'm looking forward to going over with you. So background for the statewide water education action plan. SWEAP, as we call it, is Colorado's first statewide water education action plan designed to support the Colorado Water Plan's goal of sustainable water by 2050. And if you're not familiar with the Colorado Water Plan, it was a major collaborative effort across the state, first done in 2015, now set to be updated between now and then 2022. And that really guides the work of the state and various partners around the state in ensuring sustainable water for Colorado. So SWEAP is the environmental education and water education sort of outcome of that plan. So in the plan, it was identified that we need a common vision for water education across the state, and SWEAP is that plan, that vision. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, a little background about why SWEAP, how it works, and then we'll start talking a little bit about finding common ground between SWEAP and the environmental education plan. We'll do breakout groups. Each group will get a different segment of each plan that compare nicely with each other. And then we'll have a group discussion at the end where we see those points of commonality and opportunities to leverage resources as well as potential challenges. So looking forward to that discussion. All right, so why SWEAP? So the Colorado Water Plan predicts a water supply shortfall of 500,000 acre-feet by 2050, and that's just considering municipal and industrial needs. When you consider agricultural needs, the gap becomes even larger. And the water plan itself called for, in chapter 9.5, and in the outreach, education, and public engagement chapter, called for this need to expand outreach and education efforts that engage the public. And the focus here is really to promote well-informed community discourse and decision-making regarding balanced water solutions. So that is the key component of the water plan that was pulled right into SWEAP as the SWEAP impact statement. But the coalition of water educators and stakeholders around the state who developed SWEAP also felt it was important that we acknowledge sort of the individual and community level impact. And that's really where this next phrase comes in terms of empowering Coloradans to take an active role in their communities and to make informed decisions about critical water issues. So we have that sort of that state level discourse decision making, but also that individual community level impact. And so how was SWEAP put together? How was it created? We received funding, we being Water Education Colorado, received funding from the Colorado Water Plan Engagement and Innovation Grant Program. And we also received money from Think Water, a systems thinking collaborative funding coming from USDA, but really centered out of one of the extensions at the University of Wisconsin. And then, so that's how we got our funding. And then Conservation Impact is who we contracted with to help run that collaborative process. So they did a situational analysis. They did pages and pages of stakeholder interviews and educator interviews. And that's where we came to that situational analysis. Where are we today with water education in the state of Colorado? From there, we developed a coalition of water educators and stakeholders from around the state. That acronym there that you see, PEPO, that's Public Engagement and Participation and Outreach. So that's part of a system of different roundtables in the different major river basins around the state. So there's 9 different roundtables around the state based around these river basins. And then each one has a PEPO group. And those PEPO groups have liaisons, individuals who are really helping to drive forward the public engagement, participation, and outreach in those basins. So they were part of the coalition as well as the others you see listed there. I'll talk about the Water Educator Network towards the end of our presentation, but they were a key part. And then we went through a strategic planning process. We met in April of 2019 up at Keystone Policy Center, and they helped frame out the vision and impact of water education around the state, as well as outcomes and goals and strategies. The identification of actions was really intentionally left up to basins and organizations and programs to define based on the audiences that they serve. So that was an intentional step. In terms of how SWEAP works, it's the first of its kind. It's 5 years, so it's between 2020 and 2025. We're looking to make an impact through water education by 2025. And it's also Colorado specific. So it's meant to strengthen local and regional water education efforts through a shared vision that will also advance Colorado's water plan. And I talked a little bit about that, the vision in terms of nesting within that water plan goal of sustainable water by 2050. SWEAP is really water education's role in reaching sustainable water by 2050. And then the SWEAP impact, again, is that sort of that 2-part state level discourse decision making, and then also that individual community level action. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions that have come through on the chat, or if you have questions so far, take a minute and type them into the chat. I'm going to get a drink of water. All right, and there might be a few people interrupting me over time. I've invited them to interrupt if they see questions coming in through the chat. That's just, it'll be part of the presentation. So feel free to continue to write your questions or comments in the chat. The education continuum was another big step forward in water education. So you all are environmental educators. You've probably seen a variety of different education continuums over your careers. This one is 4 parts, and it starts with awareness, knowledge and skills, behavior change, and then all the way on to systems change. So this education continuum helps us define what we mean when we talk about water education or the role of a water educator. And it also highlights that even though the strategies used by a public relations official, it might be different than something used by a classroom educator in a K-12 setting, they both contribute to the SWEAP impact. They both have unique strategies and skills that eventually will lead us to reaching those outcomes for SWEAP. So you'll see that education continuum carried forward into the SWEAP framework. And the framework in terms of the outcomes and the strategy, the metrics and strategies. So each of those are organized according to the discipline from awareness to systems change. You'll also notice that the strategic framework has sort of a nesting relationship again with that sustainable water by 2050, the Colorado Water Plan, and that education outreach and public engagement chapter of the water plan. In addition to the vision and impact, 2 other overlaying components of SWEAP are the critical water concepts and the guiding principles. So I'll get into those in a minute, but this framework is really intended to be the backbone of SWEAP. And the idea is that if we have a shared vision and these guiding principles and a core set of shared outcomes, then all of our individual actions together will have a greater impact. And you've probably heard that kind of thinking and phrasing before. So the critical water concepts are the concepts that are really the foundational understandings of water in Colorado for individuals to really internalize if they are to effectively engage in discourse and decision-making around Colorado water issues. So if we're asking for increased participation in discourse and decision-making around how we use and allocate water in Colorado, we also need to prepare and educate our audiences with these concepts. So I'll just note there's 6 of them, and each one of them are intentionally balanced, and it was important to the coalition that these be balanced, and I'll note one way in which that's done. So if you look at concept number 4, in 4th grade or whenever it is that a student will learn that water cycles naturally through Colorado's watersheds. Hopefully they start to learn that before 4th grade. Even though water cycles naturally through Colorado watersheds, it's also often intercepted and manipulated through an extensive infrastructure system built by people. So when we talk about mapping watersheds and how water flows in Colorado, it's not as simple as drawing those lines across elevations and topography to determine where the water is going. We need a deeper understanding, and we need to also recognize, because of water scarcity in Colorado, we've built up this infrastructure system that helps support our communities. So that's sort of a foundational understanding in order to participate in the water discourse. And then also overlaying the plan are a set of guiding principles. And these principles include that water education is balanced and reflective of trade-offs. So there's no new water in Colorado or in the world. And so any decision we make around water has a trade-off. So we need to recognize that in the way we educate. But it's also important that we're objective and fact-based with the education we provide, and that the education around SWEAP is accessible, engaging, and striving for equity. So just 3 of the guiding principles there to give you an idea. And then I'll take another pause there just in case any questions have come up on the continuum or the guiding principles or critical water concepts and how we arrived at that point. Awesome. And again, feel free to type in the chat if you have any questions. So we'll keep an eye on that. All right, so now we're going to dive in to some specific outcomes that are within SWEAP. And again, at the end of the presentation, we'll start to put those and their associated strategies side by side with the environmental education plan. So under awareness, there's one strategy in SWEAP, and I'll read this the full outcome out, and then for the rest of them, I'll summarize them. So for awareness, that outcome there is that the proportion of Coloradans in each river basin who can identify how water supports their quality of life, as well as threats to and potential solutions for a sustainable water supply increases. So you'll notice repeated again and again are a few phrases. So the proportion of Coloradans in each river basin. So that was important to the SWEAP Coalition that we call out that we want to make progress around Colorado within the different river basins. And we also recognize that based on experiences that you'll have in a different river basin and just the nature of water and water availability in the different river basins, people will be coming from a different starting point in this level of awareness. So that was important, making progress in each river basin. And also you'll notice that the phrase increases is repeated over and over again. And that's because in water education, we really don't have a great baseline of where we're starting on a lot of these things. And that's really one of the big pushes with SWEAP in the early phases of implementation is helping to identify those metrics for each outcome and establish some baselines. Where are we starting? Where are the intervention points that will be most effective in advancing knowledge around critical water issues?
We had one question pop in, Scott. My name here, I'll just show people. My name's Annie Carter, I'm the chat monitor. So Betsy Leonard asked, who does SWEAP work with on the local level?
Great question. So SWEAP, again, is really meant to be this overarching framework, a common vision across Colorado. But at the local level, any organization can participate in implementation of SWEAP. And again, just a reminder that those guiding principles are critically important when we talk about how we're participating in SWEAP. So any organization that's willing to embrace those guiding principles and advance these outcomes and associated strategies is welcome to participate in SWEAP and encouraged to participate in SWEAP. And then in terms of local level, what we've done is we've worked with these different stakeholders and water educators in the SWEAP Coalition, sort of as a representative sample of water educators around the state. But we know that we're not going to get to the level of individual outreach to each water educator. So I hope that helps. And there are some resources where we can have some next steps around this. If you're an organization that's interested in helping to implement SWEAP and you want to tell me all about where you see your organization plugging in and also the resources that you need. So Kirsten, if you're willing to paste in the chat that SWEAP Google form, that SWEAP Google form is a great place to be able to say, how do you feel like you might plug in and what resources would you need to help advance SWEAP? We can come back to that as well. Hope that answered the question. If not, feel free to keep asking questions in the chat.
There was sort of a continuation of that question. Just, do you depend on community initiatives if you have nothing organized?
Yeah, great question. So the organizational framework for SWEAP implementation will really be built around the Water Educator Network. And the Water Educator Network is now free to join through Water Education Colorado. And Kirsten, if you're willing to paste that link in as well. And that's where organizations who operate at the local level can share resources and ideas. And that's an organizing framework. And then in addition to the Water Educator Network, or we call it WEN, we'll also have some task forces that are really intended to bite off certain chunks of the SWEAP strategy. So for example, the first task force that we're going to be working on is the critical water concepts and Colorado academic standards, and identifying where we have connection points between the critical water concepts and existing science and social studies standards, and then what types of methods, what types of skills are most important as identified in the NGSS standards, for example, for when we're teaching about critical water concepts. So what are the best recommendations from sort of that national perspective and state perspective on how we talk about the critical water concepts? So it's going to be a nice blending in those two. So that's going to be a small task force working on that. And then again, that Water Educator Network is kind of that collaborative effort across the state that will be ongoing. And keep the questions coming, please.
Okay, we do have more. So
yeah.
This might be part of your presentation coming up, but we had one question about your plan to evaluate these outcomes.
Great question. So again, we need to really establish those baselines for each of these outcomes. And so each outcome is going to have a metric associated with it. And that metric may be informative at the state level in terms of how the protocols that will identify for measuring that, whether it be a statewide survey or whether it might be an objective analysis, for example, of the type of information available or the type of policies that we see related to water literacy, encouraging water literacy in the state. So that will be determined by the type of metrics that we have. So the type of methods we're going to use to collect the data will be determined by the type of metric. But then when you talk about, that's at the sort of the statewide level, so how are we collectively making progress? But a lot of these you can also take down to the local level and the program level. So for example, as we develop these protocols, and some of them already exist and have existed, for example, I'll jump back a slide. The Rocky Mountain PBS had a water week, and they sent out a survey to people who participated in that and asked them questions around whether people felt confident that they had the knowledge necessary to take an active role in water stewardship in their community. So that was one step in helping to establish a baseline for that community. And then also that same question related to skills. So even if you have all the knowledge in the world around water, you got to have some skills to step into a water decision-making process to be able to effectively engage. So we also asked that question in that survey, that Rocky Mountain PBS survey. So I think we have that state level, again, way to measure. But I think eventually, as we start developing protocols for each of these outcomes, we'll have some ways and hopefully some pilots in terms of people who are willing to take that guinea pig step of using these outcomes in their programs to be able to measure at the program level. All right, and I'll jump into behavior change and systems change, and then I'll have a question for you with a poll. So in terms of behavior change, we have 3 outcomes related to behavior change in SWEAP. And the first one is all about that participation. So really that thrust of the water plan objective around water education is participation. So participation in community discourse and decision processes about water really starts to ramp up. And now is a great opportunity because the water plan, we're starting in on the water plan update, or Colorado Water Conservation Board is, and the different basin roundtables. So now is a great time to get involved in that. And then also that voters have access to factual information when they're asked to make a decision about that might impact water resources. And then third, this is where we get to that individual level impact. So the proportion of Coloradans in each river basin that are demonstrating sustainable water behaviors increases. So again, you'll notice that we talk about each river basin. So based on the supply of water and the built landscape in the different river basins, these sustainable water behaviors might be different from the Yampa River Basin to the urban South Platte, for example. So we're going to leave that up really to some work with entities in river basins to define what those sustainable water behaviors might be, and then measuring progress on those. So that's the 3 behavior change related outcomes. And then the 3 systems change outcomes are, where relevant, local and state policies and practices are supportive of advancing statewide water literacy. So you think back again to that work of the task force of identifying alignment between the critical water concepts and state standards. That's a 1 step kind of in that direction. And then where relevant, local and state policies, regulations, and practices demonstrate a consideration of impacts on sustainable water resources. So when the state legislature is considering a bill, to what extent do they weigh the impacts on sustainable water resources in their debate of that bill? And then again, at the local level, same idea. And that also brings in ideas about, land use decisions, other things as well. And then finally, water decision-making bodies are increasingly representative of the demographic makeup of the area they serve. Water in the water sector has historically been male-dominated and also overwhelmingly white in terms of the representation in these different water decision-making bodies. So the idea here is that if we make statewide progress equitably across demographics, we're going to start to see increased participation in that. And the hope then is if we reduce these certain barriers, we'll start to see increasing representation. And if we're intentional about that, we'll start seeing increasing representation on these decision-making bodies. So maybe I'll pause there and let's pop up that poll, that 3rd poll. And this poll is all about how you see your organization contributing to one or more of the different disciplines. So if we think of awareness, knowledge and skills, behavior change, or systems change, and those outcomes within each of those, where do you see the work that you do and your organization and your program does advancing each of those? So I'll give you about 20 seconds. I'll stop talking and we'll take a look. All right, great. Kirsten, are you willing to pop up the results from the poll? Awesome. So this is not, this is quite familiar in terms of the distribution of folks in this group and how you see yourself aligning with different SWEAP disciplines. We saw the same thing when we did a lot of outreach during SWEAP development. So a lot of organizations identify with this awareness and knowledge and skills, and then we start to see fewer identify with behavior change and system change, which makes sense, right? Water Education Colorado, for example, is a nonpartisan, objective, non-advocacy organization. So the extent to which we could be involved in specific systems change outcomes is limited. But there are water educators around the state who do work in sort of the policy space. But I'd also sort of push that conversation as well, in that water educators and environmental educators also have a role in sort of providing the factual information and the experiences that will help people when they're faced with a decision, be them policymakers or individuals. They'll have that information and that experience to fall back on when they're weighing the trade-offs of a policy or when they're voting in upcoming elections. So just to push on that conversation just a little bit. All right. Keep the questions coming in the chat if you have them. I'll do a couple more slides here on how you can get involved and how we see the different types of groups engaging with SWEAP, and then we'll leave some time for discussion about SWEAP and the Environmental Education Action Plan, or sorry, the Environmental Education Plan. All right, so in terms of how you can get involved, we talked a little bit about this, but organizations and individual educators, we envision them developing actions, again, to meet the unique needs and interests of your communities, while also contributing to those shared outcomes identified in SWEAP. So it's kind of up to you, you know your community the best, but we also really encourage that alignment to the statewide strategy. And then no one is expected to address every outcome or embrace every strategy. For example, if it's a conflict with your the way your organization is set up to operate on systems change strategies, then that's fine. We're just looking to, as a collective, make impact and progress on each of these outcomes. So SWEAP is really intended to bridge water education gaps across the state by supporting and expanding your reach. All right, so in terms of utilizing SWEAP, here's some ideas of how each group can participate. Water Education Colorado is myself and our executive director, Jayla Poppleton. We're really excited about continuing to guide a focused statewide strategy, offering resources and support. We talked about convening these task forces, as well as to track progress. So that's a big lift for us as a relatively small organization, but to the extent to which we can develop partnerships to make that happen, we can get it done. So we're excited about continuing to play that role. And then also the BRTs and PEPOs, again, BRTs are basin roundtables in the 9 different major river basins across the state. And then the PEPO groups are the public engagement, participation and outreach within those different basin roundtables. And so they develop education action plans each year. So we're encouraging them to incorporate SWEAP into those. And then also this BIP, or the BIP updates, that's the basin implementation plans. So that's sort of that local basin-based projects and plan that feed into the Colorado Water Plan update. So we're encouraging them to consider SWEAP and educational strategies as they do that. And then the CWCB is the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and they're in charge of overseeing the update to the Colorado Water Plan. And we're excited to continue working with them to incorporate SWEAP and to measure our progress on the water education side. And then finally, other educators, we again really encourage educators to identify that alignment, where you see your programs fitting with SWEAP outcomes, contribute to a statewide strategy, really celebrate and amplify each other's efforts. And we're happy to tell that story at the statewide level. If you have a great story to tell, email me at scott@wateredco.org, and we're happy to share that on social media or otherwise, because it is also about celebrating the work that's already going on that contributes to this statewide impact. And then again, sharing resources. So Kristen, if you're willing to pop in the chat again, I think a couple things that might be helpful, if folks haven't clicked on it yet, are that the SWEAP Google form. That's where you can identify that alignment. And then I think also just that general link to the SWEAP website might be another good place to look. So thanks for that. And then in terms of our discussion today, so I'll have some next steps at the very end of the presentation after we come back, but I'd really like to spend the next bit of time here hearing from you all. So let's bring it all together and talk about what similarities we see between the plan elements, between SWEAP and the Environmental Education Plan for Colorado, and then what are key differences. We'll also talk about challenges we see in finding common ground and implementing each plan, and then what opportunities we see for leveraging resources between the different plans, across the plans, and otherwise. So those are the questions we're going to ask, and like any good educator, I'm going to try to model this, or at least walk through this on the next slide. for some of the basic elements. So in terms of finding common ground on these key structural elements of the environmental education plan and SWEAP, the basis for the environmental education plan, and Katie, feel free to jump in at any time, was Colorado state legislation. And the basis for SWEAP, again, was the Colorado Water Plan. So the state legislature actually called for the development of the environmental education plan, which really adds some strength to that effort. SWEAP, again, is an outcome of that water plan. The lead for the environmental education plan was the Colorado Department of Education, as well as the Department of Natural Resources. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife was that key lead within DNR. And then also CAEE was a key lead in developing that plan. The lead for SWEAP, again, was WECO, with funding from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So think about how we interact with different state agencies on related material. The coalition for the environmental education plan was regional councils around the state. And then the coalition for SWEAP was this statewide coalition pulled from different regions of water educators, as well as input and feedback from the Water Educator Network. And so maybe here's where we get into a little bit of that similarities and differences, and where we can help move the needle one way or the other with SWEAP and the environmental education plan. So the audience, the explicit audience for the environmental education plan, was a pre-K through 12 audience, whereas SWEAP was broader. And that was water educators of all types and levels, pre-K through adult. So a pretty big tent for that one. And that allowed the environmental education plan to get more specific, as you'll see on some strategies related to working in that pre-K through 12 environment. And SWEAP had to stay a little bit more high level in some of those areas. So you'll notice that. Hopefully in the next, in your discussion. And then in terms of what's new, I'll just say briefly, there's a few new things on the environmental education plan, and SWEAP is entirely new. So from the entire strategic framework down. So that's a little bit of compare and contrast on the overall elements of SWEAP and the environmental education plan. And now, hopefully we have enough participants to do this. Looks like we have about 11 non-facilitating participants. So I think 3 groups will work. And so again, we're gonna ask these questions. What similarities do you see between the plan elements? What are the key differences? And this is a great time to add in, Kirsten, if you're willing, that link to the Google Doc. And each group will have a slide that you're assigned, and you'll also have an opportunity to include notes on a similar page to this one. So you'll have a slide with these questions, as well as some plan elements that are side by side between SWEAP and the environmental education plan. Hope that made sense. If not, feel free to type in questions. And now would be a good time to open the Google Doc, so you can compare what I'm saying and whether it'll make sense in terms of what you're able to see in front of you. So again, we're asking what similarities you see between the plans, key differences, challenges we see in finding common ground and implementing each plan, and then what opportunities we see. So I think we'll have time for at least, let's say, maybe 11 minutes of discussion. We'll say 10, and then we'll call it back and have a group report out. So Kirsten, if you're willing to kind of tee up 3 different groups, and these will be randomly assigned. And the group number, if you're in group number 1, you're going to be focused on mission, vision, and impact. If you're group number 2, you're going to be looking at guiding principles between the 2 plans. And then if you're group number 3, you're going to be looking at goals and strategies. And you got a lot of work to do. Group number 3, all the groups, but group number 3, we're really counting on you, okay? So, all right, Kirsten, looks like you've posted the Google Slides. If anybody has had any issues opening that up, please type in the chat now before we break you up. And all right, So Kirsten, if you're willing to set up those breakout groups and make sure to nominate one person in your group to take notes on that first slide, the question slide, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a productive discussion. I'd love to kind of get some highlights from each group, and I can start for our group. Actually, anybody who is with me in our group willing to kind of share out some of the themes that came out? If you're willing to raise your hand, because we didn't nominate anybody. So it's not just me yabbering on. Okay, no? All right. Natalie, you want to do it? I'll
try. Right, since I can't see the notes, I'll have to try to remember. The piece that our group had to look, there it is, that we all talked about was the opportunities that we see for where SWEAP and CAEE are similar and different. And one of the things that seemed very similar is the collaborative approach that both are wanting to accomplish. So I think we can really take advantage of that in terms of those excellent environmental educators who may come at this from the CAEE environmental education plan lens, really just switching in and using more water topics in their teaching will help the SWEAP goals become more integrated and more achievable. So that was a really close one in terms of the collaboration piece. One where SWEAP doesn't encompass, but the environmental literacy plan does more so, is the idea of doing this through a variety of different kinds of learning experiences. So I think that's something that we can take there. And the scalability was a big thing. Katie pointed out that really we need to talk about all of this happening, but it's happening in pockets. Water education is happening in pockets, environmental education is happening in pockets, but it might not be happening for every kid. And so how we look at that a little bit more is going to be important. And it all goes back to establishing what people already know in their baseline understandings. So jump in, Katie, and you guys, if you think of something else I forgot.
That's great. Thank you for the summary, Natalie. And I just got our 5-minute warning. So we have 5 minutes left for each of the groups, the second two groups to share, and then just a little wrap up at the end. So thanks for that. And there are upcoming opportunities. Sign up for the Water Educator Network if you're interested, and where we can continue this conversation, even though we'll get cut off a little bit early today. All right, so I guess we were group number 2. Breakout room number 1. Do you have someone who's willing to share?
I took notes, so I guess I can do it. I couldn't edit the slide, but I have a notebook. So some of the differences we found between the mission, vision, and impact for CEP, it's specifically K-12 based, a lot of outdoor learning experiences, so a lot more experiential and more of a knowledge and awareness level we found. Whereas SWEAP is more of a broad audience, it can be adults or children. We also noticed that there's a little bit more of like a marketing and public service tied to it. And then another big difference we found was that SWEAP had a lot more like action and next steps and tangible metrics, whereas a lot of CEP is knowledge. But similarities, both educating for informed citizens to eventually have behavior change leading to action, ecological literacy for stewardship, collaboration between organizations, self-selecting local actors, and increasing diverse representation. Sorry, I'm trying to talk fast so the other group can share. And then challenges, we saw was just creating those tangible steps from knowledge to action, that we saw opportunities to create collaborative networks and partnerships there. And also maybe a need to collaborate on maybe a broader like evaluation scale so that we can overall serve a broad audience and make sure we're being impactful.
Great. Thanks so much, Shoshana. Is that awesome? And I hope I captured enough of your notes. But also feel free to email me if you have any additional things that I missed. So, okay, group number 3, we got a minute or so if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I also wasn't able to edit this. It didn't allow me to edit the slides, but I just took some notes here. So we were looking at the goals and strategies between the 2 different plans. And for similarities, we found there was a lot in common. Both emphasized the importance of collaboration, not just with other organizations, but also with the communities themselves, and professional development for teachers and educators, and also pathways. They both identified some form of pathways for youth and adults to become more interested in the field of water education, environmental education. Some differences that we noticed are that the SWEAP plan maybe just went into a little more detail, we felt, how it defined the education component of the goals. And someone also noted that it maybe defined a cultural shift a little bit better of how we need to incorporate different perspectives and our community in order to help make this information relevant. Not that the Colorado Environmental Education Plan didn't do that. We just felt SWEAP went into a little bit more detail there. The next question we had was what challenges we saw in finding common ground and implementing each plan. And this has already been said a little bit before, but something that immediately came up was funding of, well, it can be difficult to provide professional development opportunities or even certain youth education programs when we're charging teachers or asking them to pay for something. That can be a difficult process. And also just making this information accessible. We talked about in our group, who really is comfortable with what a water basin is or watershed is. I mean, I took an amazing water professional development course, so for me that was, but I agreed, like, it's not necessarily obvious to a lot of people and community members and even teachers of what some of those terms mean. So I think defining that and funding. And then as far, I'm trying to talk quick, as far as what opportunities we saw, I think as others had mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity for collaborating and working together and forming stronger partnerships. And I think one too that I was thinking of is just how can I better incorporate, for example, water education and the sustainability of our water within what I'm teaching. I work for Colorado Parks and Wildlife and focus more on wildlife, but water is key to all of us, including wildlife. So it was also, like, again, in my example, just a reminder of, okay, what are small ways that I can just incorporate it that are, easy for people to digest? And I don't know if anyone else in my group wants to speak. Feel free to add. I don't think I captured all of our notes.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erin. I'm just gonna, I know we're a little bit over time and into the break, and those breaks are so important. I'm gonna ask just real quick, Kirsten, if you're willing to pop up the final poll. And the poll is just, this is kind of a subset of, if you go to that Google form and type in how you see yourself or your organization being involved in SWEAP, this poll is sort of a subset of that in terms of what are some next steps you might see yourself or your organization taking related to SWEAP, and then we'll close it out. And while you're answering that, I'll just really encourage everybody to stay in the loop through Katie and CAEE on the update to the environmental education plan. What you saw today on the slides was just a very small piece of what's in the environmental education plan. So when we had conversations about, level of detail and level of strategies, a lot of that may be there. It's just not what was shown at the high level in the slides today. So really invite you to be involved in that process. Thank you all for your time today. And it looks like a lot of you have identified some potential next steps. So thanks so much. Kirsten, if you're willing to save the chat and if you can save the poll results, I don't know, but I think that will be really helpful. And thank you, Aaron and Shoshana, again for your notes. Appreciate everybody's time, and hope to see you throughout the conference.
So thank you, Scott, for that presentation. That was wonderful and answered a lot of our questions. I did not know about SWEAP, so I learned a lot today. And then I hope all of you learned something that you can take away with this. We did record this, and we are saving the chat, and it will be, you can find this in Shed, and it'll be linked to this session. So now you get a few minutes. Actually, we're going to break for lunch before 12:15 the CAEE annual lunch starts. So we have a little bit of time to take a stretch break and walk outside and then enjoy a little outside air. Smoky, but still outside. Thank you, everybody.
Kirsten, thank you so much. And Annie, thank you. I really, really appreciate your help. I don't know how I could have managed the different components without your help. So let me know if you have any questions or anything I need to know. Otherwise, I'll plan on signing off.
Okay.
Yep, I was just making sure I had the chat saved before I closed out.
Great. Thank you, Annie, for doing that. And I'm going to stop recording right